The sound that made everyone turn wasn't loud. It was the silence that followed. The crystal chandelier above the grand hall of the Whitmore Hotel shimmered under 1,000 soft lights. But beneath it, something invisible had just shifted, something no one could name, yet everyone could feel. Emily Carter stood perfectly still at the center of the room, her hand resting lightly against the curve of her 7-month pregnancy, her breathing slow, controlled, almost too calm for a woman whose entire world was about to be rewritten. Around her, the elite of Manhattan moved in polished circles, tailored suits, diamond bracelets, laughter that sounded rehearsed. But their voices began to fade, one by one, as attention quietly, almost instinctively, drifted toward her. It wasn't what she said. She hadn't said anything yet. It was the way she stood, the way her eyes didn't search for approval anymore. 3 hours earlier, Emily had been invisible in this same room. Just another quiet wife standing beside Richard Hayes, the billionaire whose name alone could silence boardrooms and bend negotiations. She had worn the same dress, the same heels, the same composed smile. But back then, she had been waiting for acknowledgement, for kindness, for something that never came. Now, she was no longer waiting. Across the marble floor, Richard laughed at something Vanessa Cole whispered into his ear, his hand resting casually at the small of her back, a gesture so familiar it barely registered as scandal anymore. To the outside world, it looked like power, like confidence, like a man who had everything under control. But Emily knew better. She knew the pauses between his words, the tension hidden beneath his polished tone, the cracks he believed no one could see. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and for a brief second, the soft clink of glass against glass echoed louder than it should have, like a signal no one had agreed on, but everyone understood. Emily exhaled slowly. This was the moment. Not the beginning of the end, but the end of pretending. 2 years ago, she had walked into this marriage believing in something simple, something almost naive. Stability. Partnership. A future built quietly behind the scenes of Richard's empire. She had given up her own career, her own identity, folding herself into the rhythm of his world, convincing herself that sacrifice was part of love. But love, she would learn, doesn't erase you. It reveals you, or it breaks you until there's nothing left to reveal. The first sign had been small. A missed dinner. A late-night call he stepped outside to take. A name mentioned once, then never again. Vanessa. It had sounded harmless then. It didn't stay that way. Emily didn't move as Richard's eyes finally met hers across the room. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed between them. Not guilt, not fear, something colder. Calculation. He gave her a brief nod, the kind reserved for acquaintances, not wives. Not the mother of his child. That was when it became clear. This wasn't going to be a quiet unraveling. This wasn't going to happen behind closed doors. Whatever came next, it would happen here, in front of everyone. And for the first time, Emily Carter didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. The air shifted before anyone understood why, like a pressure change before a storm, subtle but undeniable, and Emily could feel every pair of eyes slowly aligning without a single word being spoken, as if the room itself had decided something was about to happen. She adjusted her posture, not to impress but to steady herself, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric over her stomach, grounding, reminding, anchoring her to the one truth that had never betrayed her, while across the room. Richard resumed his conversation with that effortless charm he had perfected over decades, the kind that convinced investors, persuaded partners, and erased inconvenient realities. Yet tonight there was a fraction too much force in his laughter, a slight delay in his responses, the kind of imperfection only someone who had studied him for years would recognize, and Emily recognized all of it. Vanessa leaned closer to him again, whispering something that made him smile, and for a moment the two of them looked like a photograph of success, curated and complete. But Emily knew photographs could lie. She had lived inside one for too long, smiling at events like this, nodding at conversations she was never meant to join, slowly becoming a background detail in a life that was supposed to be hers. She remembered the first gala after their wedding, how Richard had introduced her with pride then, his hand firm at her back, his voice warm, calling her his partner, his future, and she had believed him, every word, every promise. She had believed in the late nights at the office because they built something bigger. She had believed in the missed holidays because success required sacrifice. She had believed in him, until belief became a habit and habit became silence. A glass somewhere behind her touched a marble surface too sharply, drawing a brief glance from a nearby couple, and Emily noticed how quickly people pretended not to notice discomfort, how trained they were to protect the illusion, and she wondered when she had learned to do the same. It had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, almost gentle, like a door closing inch by inch until there was no light left. First it was the canceled dinners, then the forgotten conversations, then the way Richard stopped asking her opinion entirely, decisions made without her, plans adjusted around her absence as if she had already left, even though she was still standing right beside him. She had found out about Vanessa not through confrontation but through pattern, a name that appeared too often, a schedule that shifted too conveniently, a tone in his voice that no longer belonged to her. And when she finally asked, not accusing but hoping, he had not denied it. He had simply reframed it, as if loyalty was outdated and she was unreasonable for expecting it. Emily closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough to remember the moment she stopped arguing, not because she agreed, but because she understood. This was not something she could fix, it was something she had to outgrow, and that realization had been quiet, almost invisible, but it had changed everything. Now, standing here again under the same lights that once made her feel small, she felt something entirely different, not anger, not fear, but clarity. The kind that does not shout, the kind that settles deep and steady. And as Richard finally began to move toward her, perhaps sensing the shift he could not yet define, Emily lifted her gaze to meet his fully, not as a wife seeking recognition, but as a woman who no longer needed it. And in that brief, suspended moment before either of them spoke, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a truth that had already arrived. Richard stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough for anyone watching to assume this was just another quiet exchange between husband and wife. But there was nothing ordinary in the way he studied her now, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something familiar and failing to find it. For a brief second, the noise of the room seemed to return, a low hum of conversations resuming cautiously, as though people were unsure whether to look away or keep watching, and Emily noticed that hesitation, the subtle tension in the air that told her this moment was no longer private. It belonged to everyone in the room. "You look different," Richard said finally, his voice even, controlled, the same tone he used in board meetings when outcomes mattered. But there was a faint edge beneath it, something sharper, something uncertain, and Emily let the silence stretch just long enough to make that uncertainty grow. She did not rush to answer. She did not fill the space the way she once would have. Instead, she held his gaze, steady and unyielding, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried further than she expected. "I am," she said, and nothing more. That was the first crack, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, and Richard felt it. She could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his posture shifted as if recalibrating, trying to regain control of a situation he had not realized was slipping. Vanessa approached then, her heels precise against the marble floor, her expression composed but curious, the kind of curiosity that comes from someone used to being the center of attention and suddenly sensing that spotlight moving elsewhere. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone polished, her smile perfectly measured, and Emily turned her head just enough to acknowledge her without fully shifting her focus away from Richard, a small gesture, but deliberate, calculated. "That depends on what you think all right means," Emily replied, her voice still steady, still quiet, but now unmistakably firm, and Vanessa's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second before returning. As if she had practiced that recovery, Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, the kind meant to signal patience, but Emily recognized it for what it was, a pause to think, to strategize, to decide which version of himself to present next. And she realized then that this was the moment he would choose whether to dismiss her, to downplay her, or to confront her. And for years he had always chosen the path that kept him in control. "This is not the place," he said, lowering his voice slightly, leaning in just enough to suggest discretion, but not enough to appear defensive. "We can talk about whatever this is at home." And there it was, the assumption, the quiet expectation that she would follow, that she would agree, that she would once again move the conversation out of sight where it could be managed, contained, rewritten. Emily almost smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition, because she had heard this before. Different words, same meaning: postpone, minimize, redirect, and for a long time, it had worked. But not tonight. She straightened slightly, her shoulders relaxing, rather than tensing, and that subtle shift changed everything. It was not resistance, it was release, and when she spoke again, her voice did not lower to match his. It remained exactly where it was, clear, measured, impossible to ignore. "No," she said simply, and the word landed heavier than anything louder could have. "We will not be having this conversation at home." And for the first time since he walked up to her, Richard did not have an immediate response. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of questions, full of attention, full of realization spreading quietly through the room that whatever was happening here was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a shift, a turning point, something that could not be undone, and Emily could feel it settle into place, steady and irreversible, like a door finally closing after being left open for far too long. The word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, simple, unadorned, but final, and Richard felt it in a way he could not immediately explain, as though something he had always relied on had just quietly stopped working. He straightened slightly, his expression smoothing into something more composed, more public, the version of himself that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and walked away without a trace of doubt. But there was a delay now, a fraction of a second too long before he spoke, and in a room like this, that delay was everything. "Emily," he said, lowering his voice again, not softer but sharper, controlled. "You are making a scene," and it was meant to sound like a warning, like a reminder of consequences, but it landed differently this time. It sounded almost uncertain, as if he was testing whether that strategy still held power. Emily did not react the way she once would have. She did not glance around nervously, did not apologize, did not step closer to him to minimize the moment. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, grounded, present, her gaze steady, and when she spoke, it was not louder, but it carried with a clarity that cut through the ambient noise like a line drawn in ink. "No," she said, "I am ending one." And the distinction was subtle, but unmistakable. A nearby couple stopped mid-conversation, their glasses hovering just below their lips. And further across the room, someone shifted their stance, angling slightly to listen without appearing obvious, the entire space adjusting in quiet increments, drawn toward the gravity of what was unfolding. Vanessa's composure tightened, not visibly enough to draw attention, but enough for Emily to notice, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a recalculation, as if she was reassessing her place in a narrative that was no longer following the expected script. "This is unnecessary," Vanessa added, her tone measured, almost diplomatic. But there was an undercurrent now, something less certain, and Emily turned her gaze toward her fully for the first time, not with hostility, not with accusation, but with something far more disarming: recognition. "It was always necessary," Emily replied. "I just took longer to see it." And for a brief second, Vanessa did not respond, her practiced confidence pausing just enough to reveal the question beneath it. What exactly had Emily seen? Richard exhaled again, this time less controlled, his patience beginning to thin, the edges of his composure showing, and he stepped slightly closer, closing the distance in a way that might have once felt commanding, but now felt misplaced. "We are not doing this here," he said, more firmly, the statement no longer a suggestion, and Emily noticed how the certainty in his voice depended on her agreement, how it always had. She tilted her head just slightly, considering him, not as a wife weighing emotion, but as someone observing a pattern she had already understood, and when she answered, it was without hesitation. "You do not decide where this happens anymore." And that was the second crack, wider than the first, impossible to ignore. The music in the background continued, soft and elegant, but it no longer fit, like a soundtrack playing for the wrong scene, and the conversations that had resumed now faltered again, the rhythm of the room breaking as attention returned, more openly this time. Less concerned with discretion, Richard's jaw tightened, his gaze sharpening, and for the first time there was something close to disbelief in his expression, not because of what she was saying, but because of how she was saying it, the absence of hesitation, the absence of fear, the absence of him in her calculation. Emily felt the moment settle, not as chaos, but as clarity, each second aligning with the decision she had already made long before she walked into this room. And as she looked at him now, really looked, she realized something that had once felt impossible. She was no longer asking to be seen. She already was, and that changed everything. The shift was no longer subtle. It had taken shape, defined itself, and settled into the space between them with a weight that could not be ignored. And for the first time that evening, Richard Hayes looked like a man who did not fully recognize the room he was standing in. He glanced briefly around, not enough to appear unsettled, but enough to register the change, the way conversations had slowed, the way attention lingered longer than it should, and Emily saw it, that awareness spreading through him, not panic, not yet, but calculation adjusting to a new variable he had not prepared for. "You are overreacting," he said, the words measured, familiar, a phrase designed to reduce, to contain, to bring the situation back into a frame he could manage, but it landed differently now. Thinner, less convincing, like a line repeated too many times. Emily tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply observing, and there was something almost quiet in the way she responded. "No, I was underreacting for a long time," and the sentence did not rise, did not sharpen. It settled, firm and immovable, and that difference made it impossible to deflect. A faint murmur moved through the edges of the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but present, like the sound of something shifting beneath the surface, and Vanessa's posture adjusted again, subtle but precise, her shoulders aligning, her expression smoothing into something more guarded, as if she was now stepping into a role she had not expected to play so publicly. "Emily," Vanessa said, her voice composed. "Careful. This is not the time or place to revisit personal misunderstandings." And the word misunderstandings lingered, deliberate, an attempt to reframe, to soften, to suggest that whatever this was could still be dismissed as emotion rather than fact. Emily let that word sit between them for a second, almost considering it, before answering. It stopped being a misunderstanding the moment it became a pattern, and her eyes did not leave Vanessa's, steady, clear, leaving no space for reinterpretation. Richard's expression tightened further, the controlled exterior holding, but under strain now, his usual confidence disrupted by the direction this was taking, because this was not a conversation he could redirect with authority or charm. This was something else, something that had already moved beyond his influence. "We are not discussing this in front of an audience," he said again, more firmly. But there was a difference now, not just insistence, but urgency, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Emily inhaled slowly, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried with a clarity that seemed to settle the entire room into stillness. "You are right," she said, and for a brief second, Richard's posture eased. The smallest release of tension, as if he believed the moment might finally bend back in his direction. But then she continued, "This should have been handled privately, a long time ago." And the release disappeared just as quickly as it had come. She took a small step forward, not toward him, but into the space of the room itself. And that step changed everything. It was no longer a contained exchange, it was a declaration, quiet but undeniable. "But you made it public the moment you stopped. Respecting what we had," she added, and there was no accusation in her tone, only fact, which made it harder to challenge. The music continued somewhere in the background, soft and distant now, almost irrelevant, as if the room itself had shifted into a different rhythm entirely, one that followed her words instead of the curated atmosphere around them. Richard held her gaze, searching, recalculating, and for the first time there was something else beneath the control, something unfamiliar, not anger, not yet, but the realization that this was not a situation he could resolve in a single move. Emily saw it, recognized it, and understood what it meant, not for him, but for her, because in that moment she knew with certainty that the version of her that once waited for his response no longer existed, and what replaced it was not louder, not harsher, but something far more decisive. Something that did not need permission to continue. Something changed in the way Richard stood, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough for Emily to recognize that he had shifted from control to containment, as if he was no longer trying to lead the moment, but simply trying to keep it from slipping further. And that realization settled into her with a calm certainty. The room, once filled with curated conversations and polite laughter, now carried a different kind of energy, quieter, sharper, attentive in a way that could not be undone, and Emily could feel it pressing gently against every word, every pause, every breath. Richard adjusted his cufflink, a small, habitual motion, the kind he used when buying time, when aligning his thoughts before responding, and when he finally spoke, his voice returned to that familiar, measured cadence. "You are letting emotions distort reality," he said, each word placed carefully, deliberately, as if precision alone could restore balance. But the sentence did not carry the weight it once had. It felt rehearsed, distant, like something he had said before in situations that no longer existed. Emily's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement, and she shook her head once, slowly. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "I finally stopped letting them hide it." And the distinction landed quietly but decisively, reframing everything he had just said without raising her tone. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly, a controlled gesture, elegant, composed, but defensive in a way she would never admit, and her eyes moved between them, calculating, measuring, trying to anticipate the direction this would take, because this was no longer a private fracture. It was becoming something visible, something that could not be easily reassembled. "What exactly do you think you are proving?" Vanessa asked, her voice smooth, but with a sharper edge beneath it now, and Emily turned toward her fully again, her posture relaxed, almost effortless, as if the tension that had once lived in her shoulders had simply disappeared. "Nothing," Emily said, and the simplicity of the answer caused a brief pause, a break in expectation. "I am not here to prove anything," she continued, her gaze steady. "I am here because I already know." And the words carried a finality that did not invite argument, only recognition. A faint ripple moved through the nearby crowd, subtle shifts in stance. Glances exchanged quickly, then redirected, as if people were trying to process something they had not planned to witness. And the room itself seemed to narrow, focus tightening around the three of them. Richard's expression hardened slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, the instinct to push back against something he could not yet control. "Know what?" he asked, and there was a challenge in it now, quiet but present, as if naming it might somehow diminish it. Emily held his gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, the distance between question and answer carrying more weight than the answer itself. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It simply settled into the space with absolute clarity. "That this ended long before tonight," she said, and the words did not echo, they did not demand attention. They simply existed, undeniable. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with the understanding that something irreversible had just been spoken aloud, something that could not be taken back or reframed. And for the first time, Richard did not respond immediately, his usual certainty replaced by something quieter, something less defined. Emily felt the moment pass through her, not as a surge, not as a release, but as confirmation, the kind that does not arrive suddenly but reveals itself piece by piece until there is nothing left to question. And as she stood there, under the same lights that once made her feel small, she realized that this was not about confrontation anymore. It was about conclusion, and she had already reached it. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, and then shifted into something heavier, something that settled into every corner of the room, and Emily could feel the weight of it not as pressure, but as confirmation, the kind that arrives when nothing else needs to be said. Yet she knew this was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of what came after. Richard's gaze remained fixed on her, but there was a change now, subtle but undeniable. The confidence that once anchored his presence had loosened, replaced by something more uncertain, more searching, as if he was trying to locate the version of her that had always responded in ways he understood, and failing to find it. "You are being unreasonable," he said finally, the words quieter now, less certain, as though even he was aware they no longer carried the same authority, and Emily noticed how the sentence did not land, how it dissipated almost immediately, absorbed by the stillness around them. She took a slow breath, not because she needed it, but because it marked the transition, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, but somehow clearer. "No," she said, "I am being honest," and there was no edge in it, no attempt to push or provoke, only a simple statement that left no room for reinterpretation. Vanessa shifted slightly, her composure intact but strained at the edges now, the kind of strain that appears when control begins to slip, even if only by inches, and she glanced toward Richard briefly. A silent exchange passing between them, one that spoke of alignment, of shared understanding, but also of uncertainty. "This does not have to be dramatic," Vanessa added, her tone measured, almost reassuring, as if offering a solution, a way to step back from the edge, and Emily turned her gaze toward her once more, calm, steady. "It is not dramatic," she replied. "It is just visible now." And the words settled with quiet precision, reframing everything without raising her voice. A few feet away, someone set down a glass a little too carefully, the soft click against the table echoing louder than expected, and the room seemed to contract again, attention tightening, curiosity no longer hidden but openly present. Because this was no longer just a private conversation overheard by chance. It had become something else, something that demanded to be witnessed. Richard's jaw tightened, and for the first time there was a flicker of something closer to frustration, not directed outward, but inward, as if the situation itself was refusing to align with his expectations. "You are choosing to make this public," he said, and the statement carried a trace of accusation, but it lacked the conviction it once would have held. Emily considered that for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive, and then she shook her head gently. "No," she said again. "This was already public. I just stopped pretending it was not." And that was the third shift, quieter than the others, but deeper, because it removed the last illusion of control. The music continued in the background, but it no longer matched the moment. It felt distant, almost irrelevant, like something playing in another room. And Emily realized how little of this space actually mattered now, how the setting, the audience, the expectations had all faded into something secondary, something that no longer defined her place within it. She looked at Richard one more time, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging, and in that look there was no anger, no resentment, only clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained, and for a brief second, he seemed to understand it, not fully, not yet, but enough to recognize that whatever this was, it was not temporary. Emily let the moment settle, not rushing forward, not retreating, allowing the silence to complete what words had already begun, and as she stood there, grounded and certain, she realized that this was not about what she would say next, it was about what she would do, and that decision had already been made long before she walked into this room. Emily did not move immediately, and that stillness became its own kind of statement, something quieter than confrontation, but far more difficult to interrupt. And in that suspended moment, the entire room seemed to lean closer without physically shifting, as if everyone understood that whatever came next would not be loud, but it would be final. Richard held his position across from her, his expression now carefully neutral, the practiced mask of composure restored but thinner than before, stretched over something less stable. And for the first time that evening, he did not try to speak right away, as though he sensed that words, at this point, might only confirm what had already been revealed. Emily glanced briefly around the room, not searching for approval, not acknowledging the attention directly, but taking in the space one last time, the polished floors, the soft lighting, the curated elegance that once made her feel like she belonged to something important, and she realized with quiet certainty that none of it held any weight anymore, not in the way it once had. She shifted her gaze back to Richard, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost reflective. "I used to think this place mattered," she said, not accusing, not dramatic, simply stating something that had already passed. And the words carried a different kind of gravity, not confrontation, but closure. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, trying to understand the direction of what she was saying, trying to anticipate the outcome he could no longer predict. And Emily saw that effort, recognized it for what it was, an attempt to regain footing on ground that had already changed. I thought being here, standing next to you, meant I was part of something real, she continued, her tone steady, each word placed with intention. But it turns out, I was just part of something. Convenient. And the sentence did not rise, did not demand reaction. It simply settled, undeniable in its clarity. Vanessa shifted again, her composure now more rigid than fluid, her silence no longer strategic but cautious, as if she was beginning to understand that this moment was not about her, not in the way she had assumed, and that realization left her without a clear role to play. A faint murmur passed through the edges of the room again, softer this time, more subdued, as though the audience had moved from curiosity to recognition, understanding that they were witnessing something that did not need spectacle to carry weight. Richard finally exhaled, a longer breath this time, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, less controlled. "What do you want, Emily?" he asked, and the question carried something new, not authority, not dismissal, but uncertainty, the kind that appears when the expected outcome no longer applies. Emily paused, just briefly, not because she needed to think, but because the answer had already formed long before this moment, and when she responded, it was without hesitation. "Nothing," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to disarm the space itself. "That is the point," she added quietly. "I do not need anything from you anymore." And that was the shift that could not be reversed. The room seemed to still completely then, the background music fading into irrelevance, the soft clinking of glasses no longer present, as if even the environment had recognized the finality in her words. Richard did not respond immediately, and in that silence there was no longer tension, only understanding beginning to take shape, slow and unavoidable. Emily felt it settle, not as a release, not as relief, but as completion, the kind that does not require acknowledgement to exist. And as she stood there, grounded and composed, she realized that this moment was not about ending something loudly. It was about leaving something quietly, and that quiet carried more power than anything else in the room. For a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what had happened, but because they understood that something irreversible had just concluded without needing permission, and Emily stood at the center of it, not elevated, not dramatic, simply present in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. Richard remained where he was, his expression composed but distant now, as if he were already stepping back mentally, trying to reorganize a narrative that no longer followed his direction. And Vanessa stood beside him, quieter than before, her confidence intact on the surface but no longer driving the moment, no longer shaping it. Emily let her hand rest once more against the gentle curve of her stomach, a small, grounding gesture, and in that touch there was something unspoken, not vulnerability, but purpose, something that extended beyond the room, beyond the people watching, beyond the life she was leaving behind. She looked at Richard one last time, not with expectation, not with regret, but with a calm recognition of what had been and what had ended, and in that look there was no request for closure, because she had already given it to herself. "Take care of your world," she said quietly, the words simple, almost neutral, but final in a way that left no space for reinterpretation. And then she turned. It was not a dramatic movement, not a gesture designed to capture attention. It was deliberate, steady, the kind of turn that marks a decision already made. And as she began to walk, the soft sound of her heels against the polished floor carried further than expected, not because it was loud, but because everything else had gone quiet. The room did not stop her, no one stepped forward, no one interrupted, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to argue. And as she moved through the space, the crowd parted subtly, instinctively, creating a path without acknowledgement, as if they understood that this was not something to obstruct. The lights above remained warm, the music resumed its gentle rhythm. Conversation slowly began to return, but none of it reached her the way it once would have. It existed behind her now, already part of something she no longer belonged to. Near the exit, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to reconsider, not to look back, but to take one steady breath. the kind that does not release tension but confirms direction. And then she continued forward. Behind her, Richard did not call out, did not follow, and that absence spoke louder than anything else could have, not as defeat, but as acknowledgement that the moment had moved beyond his control entirely. Emily stepped through the doors and into the cool night air, and the shift was immediate. The quiet outside different from the quiet inside, open, expansive, untouched by expectation. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to stand still without needing to be seen, without needing to be understood. The city moved around her, distant traffic, soft wind, the steady rhythm of a world that did not pause for anyone. And yet in that movement, she felt something settle into place, not relief, not triumph, but clarity, the kind that does not fade once it arrives. She adjusted her coat slightly, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and then she walked forward, not away from something, but towards something that had not yet been defined. And that was enough, because some endings do not announce themselves with noise or spectacle. They arrive quietly, they stand firmly, and then they leave, taking everything that no longer belongs with them. And in that silence, a different kind of beginning finally has room to exist.